I think that here at the International UFO Congress, we've been very lucky to have the two most famous UFO witnesses in the world, Kenneth Arnold and Betty Hill. Kenneth Arnold, of course, was the man who saw them first, or at least the first one whose sighting got great publicity. Betty Hill was actually aboard a UFO. She was the subject of a book by John G. Fuller called The Interrupted Journey, which was published in 1966. Betty is a retired social worker from New Hampshire. She has been devoting the last 2 years to full-time UFO research and has made a number of very interesting discoveries, had some incredible experiences, and it's really an honor to be here to introduce Betty Hill.
Thank you. Thank you, Jerry. It's my pleasure to be with you tonight. And first of all, I'm going to start out telling you about my capture, which happened on September 19, 1961. On that night, my husband Barney and I were returning from Montreal. We left there in late afternoon, and then about 10 o'clock that night, we stopped in a town called Colebrook, New Hampshire. We stopped and had a lunch and had gas put in the car because we knew we would be going.
We just had a complaint that people can't see Betty, so we don't want this disembodied voice booming out over all of you. So.
Okay, so as I was saying, we stopped in Colebrook and had a lunch and had gas put in the car because we knew we'd be heading down Route 3 through the White Mountain National Forest. Since it was September 19th, a Tuesday night, beautiful night, the moon was bright, almost full, very few clouds in the sky, and Barney and I was having a very pleasant drive home to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. All of a sudden, I saw what I thought was a new star in the sky. While I'm watching this, it began to move. So we knew it was a satellite. So we stopped the car to get out with the binoculars to look at the satellite. And while we're watching this, it turned and started to come in towards us. So we knew it was not a satellite. So we're driving along, Barney's driving, I'm watching this through the binoculars, very unusual, zigzagging, acting like a yo-yo, going up and down, spinning. And it did this for about 30 miles till we came to an area called Indian Head. At this point, this object left the top of the mountain, came out over the highway directly in front of the car, and stopped. We could see a double row of windows, a red light on each side. At this point, Barney decided he's going to get out and identify this object. So he took the binoculars and stepped away from the car. And when he did, the object shifted out over the field. Barney walked towards it, looking up, and he could see human-like figures standing in the window, looking down at him. And he had the impression that one said to him, as he looked up through the binoculars, "Keep looking. Just keep looking. Don't be afraid. You're going to be all right. No harm's going to come to you. Just keep looking." And at that moment, the craft began to descend. And Barney panicked, feeling they planned to capture him. He came tearing back to the car, saying we had to get out of there. They were going to capture us. He put the car into gear, and we went speeding down the highway. Barney said when he came back, the craft had followed and was now over the car. So I looked up. I looked out the window. I couldn't see the stars or the sky or the moon. All I could see was something black. And at that point, there was a series of beeping sounds, and the car vibrated. And Barney and I stopped talking. We drove along. There were spots that I recognized that were familiar to me. Barney left Route 3. I was puzzled. I didn't understand this, but I wasn't too concerned. He turned onto Route 175 and was still speeding along when all of a sudden Barney slammed on the brakes. The car came to a screeching halt, and he made a very sharp left turn. The next thing that I could remember, we're driving along, we're back on Route 3, and I said to Barney, "Do you believe in flying saucers?" And Barney said, "Don't be ridiculous." And at that point, we heard another series of beeping sounds, and we drove home. Now, when we arrived home, there were several things that puzzled us. Both our watches had stopped functioning. The tops of Barney's shoes were scuffed. There were highly polished spots on the trunk of the car, and it had taken us 7 hours to drive 190 miles late at night, some of it turnpike driving with speeds of 65 and 70, no traffic, no police, and Barney a fast driver. So these things puzzled us. However, this was 61. We both said that we were going to keep this, whatever had happened to us, very quiet. We're not going to tell people. However, we did talk with some members of my family, and a policeman told us that anyone who had seen a strange craft should report it to Pease Air Force Base, which is located in Portsmouth. So we did call Pease and made this report. Then Barney and I started on a search to find out what we could about UFOs, because neither one of us knew anything. We got books out of the library, and in one book it said, if you've had a contact, seen a UFO, write to this address. So we did, with the result that Walter Webb came out to interview us. And he wrote up the experience, which we told him. And then later, 2 other scientists came, and they started pointing out, why did the trip take us so long to come home? They suggested the possibility of regressive hypnosis with a good psychiatrist. Well, it was a good suggestion, but we were beginning to live with the experience and leading a normal life every day when about right after Thanksgiving, I came down with pneumonia. And in 3 years, I was under treatment with my medical doctor 6 times for pneumonia. Also at the same time, Barney started having serious health problems. His blood pressure was fluctuating. He developed a very severe ulcer, and he just didn't feel well. He was sick all the time. So he wasn't responding to treatment. His doctor suggested that maybe his problem had an emotional basis, and had Barney go in and talk with a friend of his who was a psychiatrist. So Barney started going to Dr. Stevens on a regular basis. One day he happened to remember this experience in the mountains and told Dr. Stevens, who thought that we should go and have this period that we could not remember opened up by hypnosis. And he referred Barney and I both to Dr. Benjamin Simon in Boston. Now, Dr. Benjamin Simon is probably one of the top psychiatrists in the United States, possibly in the world. He had a movie made of his treatment of servicemen returning from World War II and the methods that he used to get them back into good mental health. So he was a man who was very well known and well respected, teaches psychiatry in the past at Tufts, Harvard, in our area. So Barney and I started going to him every Saturday morning for 2 hours. We were hypnotized separately, and at the end of each session, Dr. Simon gave us amnesia. So we did not know what we were saying under hypnosis, so we could not discuss it with each other. At the end of the hypnosis, Dr. Simon played the tapes back to us, which opened up our amnesia, in which Barney and I both told the same experience, but from our own viewpoint. So let's go back now to Barney bringing the car to a screeching stop, taking a left-hand turn. And this is the point, at that point, this is where we could not remember. All right, we went around a curve, and there was a group of men standing in the road. Barney stopped the car, the motor died. He was trying and trying to get the car to start. It won't. The men in the road separate, come up on each side of the car, and at that moment I panicked. I tried to get the car door open. I'm going to get out and run and hide in the woods. Just then, the door opened wide, and 5 were standing there. One put his hand out over my eyes, and I went into a sleep-like state. The next thing of which I was consciously aware was I had the feeling, I've got to wake up. I've got to wake up. And I'm struggling and struggling. And finally, my eyes open, and I look down, and I'm walking in the woods. And there are 2 in front of me, 1 on each side of me, then 2 behind me. And I turned around and looked, and here is Barney, and 2 are helping him along. He's like he's sleepwalking. And I turned around and I said, Barney, for heaven's sakes, wake up, Barney. And the one standing here said, is his name Barney? And I said, it's none of your business. And I'm still saying, Barney, wake up. So then we going through the path in the woods, and suddenly the clearing, and here is the craft that we had seen in the sky. It's on the ground. And at this moment, I stopped walking. And the one standing here said, go on. Don't be afraid. You're going to be all right. We're not going to harm you. All we want to do is some simple tests, and then you're going to be on your way home. You be safe. Go on. And I said, no. And so they started pulling. And I'm fighting, and they're pulling, and I went on, because it was a bit more of them. I had no choice. I was dragged on. And up a ramp, and there was a corridor that went around the inside or the outside wall, and this corridor was dark, no lights. And as you go in, and there was an oval-shaped door and a brightly lighted room in back of this. They took me into the first room and Barney into the second room. And I objected to this. I wanted them to bring Barney into the same room with me. And the one I call the leader said, we only have equipment to do 1 in a room at a time. It will be quicker this way. So I agreed to this. And I was taken in, sat on a stool, and my eyes, ears, nose, throat were examined. They took clippings of my hair, my fingernails, scraping of my skin. And at this point, there was the leader, and then the one I call the examiner did the testing. Now, they took a microscope, or what I would consider a microscope, kept looking at my skin. And they were very, very excited. The examiner would look, and the leader would look, and they took turns, and they were talking among themselves with great, great excitement. So then they finished this. I was put on a table where they said they were checking my nervous system. And then the examiner tried to insert a needle-like instrument in my navel, which caused great pain. And he said it was a pregnancy test. And this was 1961, and I said, that's no pregnancy test here. So then the leader stayed in the room where I was, and the examiner went into the next room to do Barney's examination. And under hypnosis, Barney told very much the same examination that I had, although instead of checking his nervous system, they were very, very interested in his bone structure, particularly the end of his spine and his feet. And also they placed a cup-like instrument on his abdomen. Now, after this experience, when we came home, a few days later, Barney had this sort of irritation that formed, and a pattern of warts developed in a circle, which continued to grow. Now, during the hypnosis, while Barney was still in the amnesia part, these warts became infected, and Barney needed to go into a skin specialist and have them removed. But until the hypnosis, he had no idea what possibility could have created this. While Barney's examination is going on, I'm in the room with the leader, and now I'm beginning to overcome some of my fears, because naturally in the beginning I was terrified. Also, I was curious, and I was also angry. So I'm now getting over these feelings, and I'm standing there, and I said to the leader, because he keeps reassuring me that now my examination's completed, Barney's is almost completed, very soon you're going to leave, and you'll be able to go back to your car and go home. So I said to him, you know, when I go home and I tell my friends about this, nobody's going to believe me. I need something to take home as proof. And he said, what do you want? And I said, what have you got? So he showed me a book. And I said, great, I'll take it. And he said, I looked at it, and he said, you're not going to be able to read it. And I said, I don't care. It's proof. So I had the book there, and then I said, where are you from? And he showed me a star map. And he said, the heavy lines on the map are where they go all the time. The lighter lines on the map are where they go occasionally. And the broken lines were expeditions. And then he said, do you know where you are on this map? I said, no. And he explained that if I didn't know the map, if I couldn't know where Earth was or where we were on the map, then he would be unable to explain it to me. Now, during the hypnosis, I drew this map. Now, at this point, the examiner came running in, opened my mouth, and he's pulling at my teeth. And I said to the leader, what's going on? Why is he doing this? And the leader said, we're very puzzled. Barney's teeth are removable and yours are not. Why? So I tried to explain to him that this is what happens to us sometimes as we get older, poor diet, things like this. So he started questioning me, what's older, age, what's age, asking me all kinds of questions like this. And he did not understand the words I was using. So then we started talking about poor diet. What's poor diet? Diet, the foods we eat. And I mentioned vegetables, so he said, describe vegetables. So I said, I will tell you about squash. It's yellow. And he said, what's yellow? So we gave that up. So at that point, Barney is coming out of the examining room. They're still helping him along. He's still very passive, as though he's sleepwalking. And now I'm delighted because I'm going to get out of this place. And Barney's being let out, so I picked up the book and I sat it out behind Barney. And the leader's walking beside me. And all of a sudden, in the corridor had been what I call a crew members as a method of identification. And I could not understand a thing they were saying, but I could sense that there was a disagreement going on. And the leader went back to them briefly, and he came back and he took the book. And he said, you cannot have the book. And I said, you gave it to me. This is my proof. He said, I know. They have decided that you're going to forget the whole thing, so you won't need the book. And I said, somehow, in some way, I'm going to remember this. And he said, well, maybe you will, but Barney will not. So then he started walking back to the car with me, and I was beginning to feel, well, I hope he wouldn't judge everybody by me because I wasn't able to answer his questions. So I said to him, if you will come back, I'll introduce you to people who can answer your questions. And he said, well, it's not my decision to make. And I said, well, I must know if you're going to come back so I'll know where and when to meet you. And he said, if we decide to come back, we will find you. So I said, there's billions of people on this earth. You'll never find me. I don't live around here. And he said, I'll find you. So he walked back to the car and he said, why don't you watch us leave? You'll be safe by the car. So he turned around and went back to the craft, and I went back to the car, and I picked up my dog, Delcy, who was shivering and shaking on the seat, and I said, come on, Barney, get out, we're going to watch him leave. And Barney's now just beginning to come out of this condition. So he came out, and we stood there leaning against the car, and I saw this craft in the woods become surrounded with a swirling orange mass. It looked like a ball, like the mass was swirling around and around like a turning ball. It went up, dipped down, went up, and was gone. Barney and I got back in the car. We went back to Route 175, to Route 3. I said to Barney, well, Barney, do you believe in flying saucers? And Barney said, don't be ridiculous. And I thought, good grief, Barney does not remember. And then I thought, I don't know who you are or where you're from, but I wish you luck. And then I started to forget too. Now this was the experience as we knew it at that point. We had relived the capture under hypnosis. We brought the professional meetings with Dr. Simon at a close in his office. Now, Barney and I did not go out of there saying, oh, goody, goody, we've been captured by a flying saucer. We left Dr. Simon's office and started meeting regularly in Dr. Simon's home on a regular basis. We went down frequently on Sundays, had dinner with Dr. Simon and Sally, and we said, okay, we got the hypnosis. What have we got? I'm as a social worker. I know how a person's brain can pick up an awful lot of things. So we started out, well, first of all, if we said maybe we were captured by a UFO, we got a terrible sense of weight, responsibility, overwhelmed with all the implications of this. We did not want to be captured. So Dr. Simon said, let's look at it as a fantasy. One of you had a fantasy, and in some way you transferred your experience to the other one. So we'll work to see who had the fantasy. Was it Barney or was it Betty? Who gave it to whom and how? Now, if we could figure out how this fantasy was transferred, this would be one of the biggest breakthroughs in the history of psychiatry. So we went down regularly, meeting with Dr. Simon, trying to figure out how this was done. We did different kinds of experiments. And every once in a while we'd say, was it really a fantasy? But we were very happy telling ourselves it was. But there was a few things that began to be puzzling to us that we could not get rid of. We could say, okay, Barney's shoes were scuffed on the top. So maybe he stubbed both shoes on a curbing. So our watches had both stopped functioning. Maybe it was a coincidence. The highly polished spots on the trunk of the car, something could have dropped in the trunk, caused those. And so we went along like this. And then we had a very puzzling thing happen. Came home one night and found a pile of leaves on the kitchen table, dried leaves. So we started looking. Somebody must have broken in. So we started looking around for some kind of forced entry. There wasn't any. So I looked, I went to scoop up the leaves and both Bonnie and I had the shock of our lives. The night of this experience, I was wearing a blue dress. I was wearing blue earrings. And now, on the kitchen table, are my blue earrings. How did they get there? We didn't want to think about it. We threw the leaves away, and I put the earrings in my jewelry box. They're still there to this day. I have never touched them. All right, now the next thing was, during the hypnosis, my blue dress. I remembered the dress I was wearing. I'd completely forgotten about it. And I'd taken my dress off, put it on a hanger, and put it way in the back of the closet, a closet filled with clothing. And during the hypnosis, I took the dress out of the closet, and it was completely covered with a pink, powdery substance. Nothing else in the closet had this. So my first impulse was to get rid of the dress. So I threw it in the wastebasket. The next day, I took it out. I put it outdoors, and after a while, the pink powder blew away. But the dress was stained, and it still is stained. Also, the dress, it was practically a new dress that night, but the lining of the dress was all torn. The stitching along the zipper was torn. Half the hem was hanging down. And that was a very difficult thing to try to explain to myself as a fantasy. Then, Bonnie and I we're still trying to convince ourselves it's a fantasy, and all this is unknown. Very few people know about this. Until finally a newspaper reporter in Boston began to get bits and pieces, rumors, and he started checking these out. Now, he did an intensive investigation, and first of all, he went up to the White Mountains, talked with people who had been spotters, watching the skies. Going back to World War II, they had all these volunteers watching the skies and reporting objects to the military that were not supposed to be there. He collected together radar reports of unidentified craft. He did an extensive investigation of UFOs in the state of New Hampshire. And then he started checking around about Bonnie and me. This all resulted in his writing a series of articles that ran for 5 days on the front pages of the Boston newspaper. And, of course, this was picked up and went out all over the world. And this was the first time that anyone had really heard about our experience. Everyone swarming around the house. The third night of the newspaper publicity, my mother called and said, "Why don't you and Bonnie get away from it all, come up here to dinner?" So we did. My mother lives about 30 miles from Portsmouth. We went to dinner, and we left my mother's house 9 o'clock that night, drove out to the end of her street onto Route 125 in Kingston, New Hampshire. Bonnie's driving. And right straight ahead of us is the second UFO of our lives. And Bonnie braked the car, put the brakes on, and he's blinking the lights. I'm yelling, "Let's get out of here." And Bonnie said, "No. They captured me. I'm going to find out why." Well, at this point, this object in the sky goes zoom, 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 and went down. Well, we knew the area. So Bonnie insists he's going to go into where that craft is. He's going to go up and knock on the door. And so I'm sitting there, And so we finally decided I wasn't going to let Bonnie go alone. So I decided, I will go with you, Bonnie, but, we're going to be reasonable about this. So we drove in, and there were wood roads, and we tried to get into the area where the craft was down. However, we could not do this because the roads ended, and they were in the middle of a swamp. But at that point, Bonnie and I both realized that regardless of what anyone thought, at that moment, we knew without a shadow of a doubt that we had that our capture was reality and not a fantasy. Okay, now, since that time, this was the capture itself. Now, since that time, we mentioned before that I've been involved in the last couple of years in UFO research. I went out in checking these out. People would call me and give me reports, and I took a map, and I set the map up with pins, pinpointing where they were seeing these crafts, and so all of a sudden began to get a pattern of UFOs going in and out of this particular area. And by following these and this pattern, I was able to establish that they were going in apparently to a certain meeting point. And this was about 5 years ago I discovered this. So nights I would go out there and sit and observe the craft coming in, and finding out that it was locally it was known as the landing area because they were landing. And I was going out, observing these, making notes, keeping records, keeping descriptions, breaking it down into all kinds of UFO-related activities such as lights, beams of light, strange prints, evidence on the ground, things like this. And then about 2 years ago, I decided that since something might happen to me, and this was a very, very valuable area, I started bringing into the area higher public officials, police, scientists. And we're now in the process of documenting all this. And we're really getting a great deal of information by direct observation of these. And so at this point, I'd like to bring this to a close. And I thank you for your attention, and I think the others now, Jerry?